introduce you quickly. Not.
Hello.
Oh, sorry.
Hello. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. I would like to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Molly Crabapple. She's an artist, a writer, and a journalist. She uses her art and her writing to cover Guantanamo Bay, the Abu Dhabi migrant labor camps, the Syrian refugee crisis, Gaza, and Iraqi Kurdistan, and the US prisons, among others, of course. She's a contributing editor of Vice, and writer, of course, with Vice, and she has written for several international publications, including the New York Times, the Paris Review, Vanity Fair, and several others. Her work is in the permanent exhibition, collection of the Museum of Modern Art, and her memoir, Drawing Blood, which we have here at on the counter, was published recently in December 2015. We have the memoir available here for anybody who would like to buy it, as well as if there are any remaining, they will be sold at the AUB bookstore. So please help me in welcoming Molly tonight. And I'll leave the floor to Molly.
I want to thank Walid and Lena so much for having me here. It's such an honor to speak at AUB. And I want to thank all of you because it's such an exquisite day out there, and I was hanging out with a cat and it was amazing, and you're all sitting in this room instead speaking to me. So I think that you are all martyrs to this speech, and thank you so much for being here and listening. Oh, so how does this sort of gauntlet of microphones work?
I do think that it's working. That's for that one.
Okay. Oh, so I hold this.
No, you can just bring it closer.
Okay.
Like. Is that good? Is that comfortable? No? That's easier. Okay.
Hello. Thank you so much to Lena and to Walid for having me here, and thank you so much to all of you for forsaking this lovely and sunlit day and all of the cats on the campus to listen to me speak. So my name is Molly Crabapple, and as Lena said, I'm an artist and a journalist. I also always feel slightly out of place when I speak at eminent institutions such as this one. You see, I dropped out of school. I do not have a fancy college degree, and I got my training as an artist by drawing sex workers and girls who danced in nightclubs. And my first real published essay as a journalist was chronicling my own arrest.
Okay, I just went to sleep. I waited so long. Let's just check. Today we're anti-technology. Every day. What was on?
So I do these really amazing drawings. You can't see them, but I assure you that each and every one of them is brilliant. You're just going to have to imagine the best thing you've ever seen, and please give me all the credit for that.
Sorry, I was sleeping. Just give it a second.
Going green.
Going green?
It's green now.
Yes, light's green, everything's green, but now we need to see light. And here it's fine?
Yes. Let's just go back one.
So while we wait for this, I'm just going to talk about my art, and you can imagine whatever you want in your head while I do it. When I do talks like this, I always try to start by asking a question, because I think that that's how we get the most interesting conversations. And the question I want to ask is a big and a pretentious one. I want to ask, can art change the world? And I ask this because I'm an artist. Since I was 4 years old, I've drawn pictures, and art has been my obsession and my addiction and my dream. As a kid who had trouble making friends, my sketchbook became the way that I interfaced with the universe, the way I could consume the entire world. And I've been a working artist for over the last decade. About 4 years ago, I started doing journalism as well. But what I did was I took the standard prose journalism and I fused it with my art. I combined art and writing, and I made this sort of new thing that you can imagine. It's really cool. Like just picture it there. It's beautiful, man. I've reported from, as Lena kindly said, from Guantanamo Bay, from the Bab al-Salem IDP camp inside Syria, from refugee camps in the Bekaa Valley, and also refugees, Syrian refugees that were living in Tripoli. I've reported from migrant labor camps in Abu Dhabi, from Gaza, and from Al-Khalil, and even from courts in New York City, which are some of the more violent places on earth, even though the violence all happens behind the scenes. And through it all, I've taken my sketchbook there. I've drawn in prisons and refugee camps and war zones, and I've had the privilege to document the work of people of astounding courage who are doing their jobs and fighting their fights in the worst possible circumstances. Now, while my work has focused on prisons, policing in the Middle East, I feel like there's another through line to my story, and that is I like to chronicle terribly smart people who are being afflicted by repression and who are fighting against it, sometimes at the most impossible odds. I wrote something about my process of becoming an artist in that book that's back there, Drawing Blood. There's the only copies in Lebanon, I think. And I've been touring the world with it. And when you tour a book, you find yourself sitting on stage like I am here, rehashing your greatest hits and the coolest things that you did in the last years of your life. And I think that this will be the last time that I sit on stage and talk about my past, because I want to go out and do things in the future, but I can't think of a better place in the world to do it. So thank you so much for being here. Because I'm both an artist and a journalist, I want to speak about the strange intersections that happen between journalism and between art. I also want to speak about the strange, mutant future that we as creators are carving for ourselves, a future where all labor is precarious, where the passive and silent audience, or the idea of one, is dead, and where we're all looking for someone who knows who the hell, what, it's oh my God. Yeah. I'm sorry for anyone who's disappointed. And where we're all looking for someone, anyone, who knows what the hell is going on, and no one does. We're living in a time of fractured certainties, where old political alliances are breaking, and where a wave of authoritarianism is sweeping the world, and most frighteningly for me, it's sweeping my own country. But despite all odds, and despite all of the conditions of the world, I have faith in both art and journalism and their capacity to fight this, in their own small but essential ways. I'll start by talking about my own journey as an artist. I was a bad kid and a bad student. I would hand in my tests, not filled with answers, but with elaborate drawings of mermaids and cruel caricatures of my teachers. I spent much of my high school in a punishment called in-school suspension, which involved being locked in a tiny room and staring at the wall. We weren't even allowed to read a book. I dropped out of university to work as a dancer and an artist's model. And I found that that was a better training than art school ever could have been, or journalism school either. Trouble, in my opinion, is the best school for an artist. Caravaggio was a criminal, and so was Goya. And nothing is more boring than someone who spends their life obediently advancing by complying with the dictates of those in charge. Being on the wrong side of those in charge teaches you to work not for external validation, but for internal compulsion. To exist outside the bounds of authority and to draw that emperor with no clothes, it teaches you to be unbowed and not shaken by any gods or masters. Art meant many things to me, but the first thing it gave me was the privilege of seeing. To draw, you have to see things anew. You have to murder your stereotypes, to do violence to your cliches. One of the most classical exercises we have as artists is drawing crumpled fabric. And why do we do that? Not out of a fetish for the loveliness of paper towels. We do it because your mind has nothing to fall back on. You might think you know what a dog looks like or a strawberry, but fabric is purely an abstract form. You have to see it how it is, and to see truly is drawing's first lesson. The second thing that art gave me was a way to look back. Like many women, I started getting sexually harassed when I was 11. And as a protective measure, I learned to walk down the street with this sort of blind indifference, straight ahead, right? Drawing gave me the permission to look around me. Later, when I was a model, my job was to be silent and look pretty. And working in a job where I essentially was an object taught me that there were no objects and there were no subjects. No one is voiceless. There are just people who are deliberately ignored. By 2010, I was working as an artist chronicling New York's nightlife. I drew sex workers and performers, these men and women who were as tough and glittering and sharp as diamonds. But I chafed against the artist's role. We were supposed to stay in our studios, churning out increasingly polished versions of our best works to sell to oligarchs until we died. We were like Fabergé egg makers fronting to be revolutionaries. I longed for engagement in the world. I was jealous of photojournalists, and at a time of infinite photographic images, I wanted to prove that hand-drawn, hand-done art still had something to say. Then 2011 happened. That was this year of ecstatic uprisings, and though each of them came from a radically different scenario, even though the groundwork for all of them was paved years in advance, and they were far more complex and diverse than many people, myself included, wanted to give them credit for at the time, 2011 still was a year of global rebellion. It was also a year of the sort of global internet-enabled solidarity that was at once powerful and also illusory. A time when protesters in Tahrir Square were sending pizzas to union guys in Wisconsin. And even though it was the gesture of a few people, magnified by the power of the internet, felt like we were all tied together at that moment. Now, it feels strange to talk about those years because it's 5 years later, right? And so many of those rebellions have fizzled out, or they've been betrayed, or they've led to horrifying consequences. And in New York, we mostly just came out of it with disappointment and arrest records, but in Egypt, they have a fascist military dictatorship. And there's the civil war in Syria. But I still want to return to that year of 2011 because it was the most crucial one in my art. In 2011, Occupy Wall Street set up camp outside my apartment. It was just down the block, and I started going down there and drawing the people in the square because suddenly the pretty girl art that I had been doing for years before, it felt like eating too much marshmallows, and I felt like I have to, everyone has to. The most crucial thing in the world is happening down the street, and I have to chronicle it. So I started drawing portraits, ones like these. Then I started doing posters. And to see my art on the streets like that felt more vital than any possible gallery display ever could have. I took those skills that I had honed for years drawing in nightclubs, and I began to apply them to documenting protest. And they were the same skills, even though when I was in nightclubs, they were seen as frilly and foo-foo. And when I was on the streets drawing cops, they were seen as somehow more intellectually valid, but they were the same. They were just seeing sharply and drawing fast, and realizing that everyone was at once subject and object. I first drew the protesters at Occupy to contravene media lies, and because portraits obsessed me. And I always wondered what it would mean to capture a face through a medium as anarchic as drawing when we live in the time of the selfie. Now, in 2011, I got arrested at a protest. And being arrested spurred me to writing, because words, they could say clearly things that a drawing could really only evoke. And though my own arrest was not bad as far as American arrests go, and I certainly wasn't beaten up, it was still an arrest, and I wanted to say clearly that even the most light, trivial arrest, 11 hours in a cell or whatever, that I had, was still something that it was hideous that America was doling out to people just because they were black and outside. That there was a fundamental sin to how the lightness with which America viewed arrest and policing. That mass incarceration and the violence done by cops was perhaps our greatest sin, and I even saw that in my very, very trivial and tiny brush with it. And after my arrest, I got a column for Vice, and from then I've been writing. When I do a piece, I always try to think, what can this drawing do that a photo can't? And I think that's the best thing to think, right? Whether you're an artist or you're a journalist or you're an actress or anything else, you want to think, what can I do that everyone else can't? What is the thing that's strange and jagged about me that differentiates me from everything else? What is the individual, unique, broken, interesting bit of me? That thing that's not going through the motions, the thing that I can't do without, then you just do that, and it's easy, right? Even before I did my first essay, I did my first sort of assignment as an artist journalist. It was with my friend Laurie Penny. She was a young British columnist, and we went to Greece together. And we did a book called Discordia, chronicling the anti-austerity protests that were happening in Syntagma Square. We spent a week speaking to, striking steel workers, to journalists that were occupying their buildings because they hadn't been paid, and so they kicked out their bosses. We hung out with anarchists, students whose futures were getting mortgaged because the crisis had, because austerity is mathematically impossible and destroys every country that it's practiced on, and we drew people who were protesting against that. Also, a lot of riot cops. They looked kind of like comic book caricatures of men with these bandoliers of tear gas. So this was the first time I ever kind of started using my work as this fusion between the surrealism that was in my head and the sort of bloody, visceral world that was in front of my eyes, trying to make something that both told the story of reality, but also was art. That it's like this uncomfortable tension. So you see, I have my crazy cop man there, towering over the city. Eleutheropia. This was an amazing investigative newspaper whose journalists had occupied it because their boss had been embezzling and had stolen the money that was supposed to be used for their wages, and so they kicked him out, and they were running this place out of sheer grit and a bit of money that they had gotten from a strike fund, and they were dedicating it all to investigative journalism. Their press room, much rocky. An anti-fascist protest. The neo-Nazi group, the Golden Dawn, in 2012 was the third most popular political party in the country, and I think it's actually rising to prominence again. But at this time, they were going into Pakistani neighborhoods, and they were telling the guys, hey, close your shops, move out of here. And so this was a protest organized by the Pakistani community that said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not scared of you. And there were major fights, and the police refused to protect the anti-fascist protesters because the police were mostly voting with the Golden Dawn. And as I illustrated Discordia, I found something interesting. I found that drawings like photojournalism, they could distill the essential, but that unlike photojournalism, unlike photography, visual art had no pretense of objectivity, that it was joyfully and defiantly subjective, and that its truth was individual. And that also was a sort of truth, and that Picasso's Guernica doesn't show what a body looks like after a carpet bombing, but does show the agony of war. I looked to so many people then when I was trying to find my voice. I looked to Goya or Otto Dix, the German painter of Weimar Berlin, who really found his voice when he was a young man who was drafted into the army in World War I and was doing these etchings, and these pen and ink drawings from the trenches that showed the horrors of war with this viscera and with this honesty and this coldness that it was unimaginable. I looked at Mine Okubo, who was a Japanese-American illustrator, and during World War II in America, the government detained all of the Japanese Americans on the West Coast in internment camps, including Mine Okubo, and she documented her detainment in these miserable concentration camps in the desert. She documented with this line that was so clean and so apt and so merciless. It's like steel. I also found that drawing as a journalist or as someone who's in journalistic situations had another advantage. It put people to ease. Now, anyone who's done journalism knows that you get most of the best stuff not by doing this very formal rapid-fire interview where you ask questions, the other person answers, and they're super on guard and they spit out their sound bites. You do it by the talking. You get that information by the talking that you do afterwards, when the people are at ease, when they think that it's done. And when you sit with someone and you draw with them, it's all that sort of relationship. It's all you sitting with your sketch pad, just hanging out. And also, I mean, in the time of the selfie, most people haven't been drawn before. And most people like it. The only one, I think one of the only people in my adult life who has not enjoyed being drawn is a New York City cop in a courtroom who attempted to tell me it was illegal, probably because I was being a bit too honest about how he looked. When I was going to Abu Dhabi, I would go to these labor camps and I'd be like an alien. Like, why is there this American girl rolling up to this camp city in the middle of the desert? And I can't speak Urdu or Pashto or Bangla or any, it was useless. But the one thing that I could do was draw, and that was how I would meet people and break the ice and make friends. I would draw, and they'd come up to me and they'd be like, oh man, you got my friend's big nose. It was like this sort of party trick almost, where instead of doing the thing with photography where there's this big machine in front of your head and it creates a barrier between you and them, you have a thing where they can see what you're doing at the same time and judge you if necessary. You could show what you're doing. It's more equal. Now, to see the world clearly, which is what artists try to do, you first have to see yourself. And my first big investigative assignment as a journalist was to cover Guantanamo Bay prison camp. In the summer of 2013, Obama had announced his plan to close the base. But at the time, 153 men were being indefinitely detained without charge, and over 100 of them were hunger striking. Many of them had announced that they were going to do it until death. Of these, dozens of the men were being force-fed. They were being shackled to a chair twice a day, having a tube shoved through their noses and into their stomachs, and then having a can of protein shake pumped through the tube. Now, these men that were detained in Gitmo, they're invisible to most people in America, because America is a country that makes a cult out of forgetting. America believes its history is wiped clean every 4 years, and that our innocence is renewed. It's like someone getting surgery to restore their virginity. So when I was at Gitmo, it wasn't really a hot story, and I was talking to the chief prosecutor during a press conference, and he told me, or didn't tell me, he told the room, that only 20 men were chargeable at Gitmo. Chargeable, not going to be charged, not guilty, chargeable. Only 20 men were even chargeable with a crime. Now, the rest of the men were people who had mostly been sold to America, because America had dropped flyers on Afghanistan offering $5,000 bounties for terrorists that people turned in. And as you can imagine, when you drop flyers in a country without a strong rule of law that offer massive fortunes for turning in people you probably don't like anyway to a foreign military power, it creates a nice kidnapping industry. And these men were now in Gitmo, rotting, getting force-fed. They'd all been tortured, and they were there, and they were just waiting, and they were waiting, and they were waiting, and they were waiting more than anything else, because America will never admit that it had done something wrong. Gitmo is a place that is built on erasure. The military would not speak the names of the men who had been detained in cages like this. These are the cages of Camp X-Ray. The guys lived here for about 4 months when the base first opened. The military wouldn't show their faces. To justify a crime like Gitmo, a crime as massive as that, they needed to make the detainees disappear. They needed to make the detainees and take them and make them into bogeymen in orange jumpsuits, not into fathers, not husbands, not sons, not men with favorite soccer teams and back pains and loves, and most of all with justified grievances with our country. So Gitmo is built on erasure, but art is a slippery thing. And I used my art to draw around censorship. To show the prison, a photographer is at the most extreme disadvantage possible because of the rules of operational security at Gitmo. They sound rational at first. You can not show anyone's head, not show a certain amount of exits, not show a certain amount of cameras, but before you know it, you're complying with all these rules and you have nothing but a camera that's pointed directly at the floor, and anything that doesn't meet that will get deleted off your phone by the nice soldier who's your minder. But with art, I could draw around that. And where the military censored me, I made it explicit. I was lucky in the courtroom. They left these nice little stickers on all of my pages to show that they had been approved. But in other cases, I did other things. For instance, I was forbidden to draw the faces of the soldiers, and so I gave them these blank masks. When I was forbidden to draw the faces of the prisoners, I scribbled black where they would be. Then I drew pictures of the guys from their Red Cross photos, like this one of Nabil Hajarab, a young man I profiled, who had been detained for 13 years without charge, the last 5 of them after he had been cleared for release. I believe that this is one of the powers of drawing, that drawing can take things that were meant to disappear into a memory hole and it can claw them back. I am a huge admirer, I'm sure, like most people even vaguely interested in art and journalism. I'm a huge admirer of Joe Sacco and his work in Palestine. And one of the things that I was most affected by was how he interviewed people who had been imprisoned and tortured by the Israelis, and then he drew their memories. Because prisons are the most censored environments in the world, and that's all because people in power don't want what they do to be made explicit. And you can't, that's stuff that you could never have gotten photographs of, but he could draw it, he could claw it back, he could make it not forgotten. Gitmo is also a land without irony. Its motto is honor bound to defend freedom. Another big investigative piece I did was in Abu Dhabi about the men that are building the great museums of the future on Saadiyat Island, the Louvre, the Guggenheim, making branches there. There's also a branch of NYU that had been built. And so there are 2 narratives really about workers in the Gulf, and I find one less problematic than the other, but they're both pretty bad. So the first narrative is, the standard Gulfy narrative, which is that these people are so happy to be doing these jobs that they don't care about being paid so little because they are so happy and they are so poor in their home country. And anyone who possibly has an objection to it is just a spoiled Westerner who isn't minding their own business because people from India love working in the sun and being arrested if they strike. That's the standard Gulf narrative. But the other narrative about it, and to me it's still problematic, is sort of the I want to call it the nice Western narrative, which you might see in the New York Times, which is says very, very true things. It talks about the recruiters that go to villages and they, find guys who don't know a lot about the world, perhaps, or who are illiterate, and they get them into a lot of debt to go over to Abu Dhabi or to go over to another Gulf country. And then when they get there, their passports are confiscated, their wages are far lower than they ever would have imagined, the working conditions are hellish. And these are all very, very true things, but my problem with them is that they stop there. And what they both these narratives, the sort of Gulf narrative and the Western narrative, leave out is they leave out the agency of the workers themselves. When I wrote about Abu Dhabi, I focused not just on the exploitation that the men had, but on their resistance. There are I want to say, from some of the statistics I looked at when I was doing the piece, there were dozens of strikes each year in Abu Dhabi that had been documented in the construction industry. And to go on strike there, it's not like to go on strike in New York or in many other places. It means not just being arrested, it means very often being deported, and thus losing your huge initial investment you incurred to go to Abu Dhabi in the first place, and yet guys were still striking constantly for their rights. So these were not people who were in any sense passive victims. These were people who were active resistors, who were standing up for themselves and standing up for the incomes that were supporting their families. Some pictures that I did, that's a barber shop in a workers' camp that guys were using to make some extra money on their day off. Also a workers' market. These guys, they're working 14 hours a day in the hot sun, and then on their one day off, they're getting cheap toys or SIM cards or porn or anything really, and having these markets and selling them for like very, very, very scant profits, but just, you know, to make extra, like to have another hustle. Like this guy here, he's selling these toys, you know, for guys who are going back home to bring to their kids so that they could, you know, show them, so they could, you know, show them they love them. This story, by the way, would in no sense have been possible without a young man whose name I can't say, but I'll call him Ibrahim. He was a guy, young Pakistani kid. He did not get to go to university, even though he very much wanted to, but he had taught himself 5 languages. And he, when he was working in the Gulf, he had joined up doing construction, but very quickly had talked his way into serving tea in an office. And he was so disgusted at the role that the Gulf would have had for him as a young working-class Pakistani man, really the racism of that role, that he started working with a lot of journalists. Not just with me, he worked with the New York Times, with The Guardian. He actually, I think he told his boss that he was always on his phone because he was addicted to Candy Crush, but in actuality was giving tips to major media. And so this guy, I mean, this Ibrahim, he had all of like the intellect and hustle and finesse of a journalist and much better language skills than any Western journalist I know. But people like him, they're often very demeaningly called fixers. And in actuality, they're producers and their fellow journalists. And the whole idea of the fixer economy is something that just enables Western, usually white correspondents to parachute in without knowing anything and have someone else like make them look awesome, but then not have to in any way share the credit. So I couldn't draw his face because it's dangerous, so I drew him reading his favorite poet. I think very often sometimes about questions of agency and how even in really well-meaning liberal discourses, there's the idea that only rich people have agency, or only people with a certain educational background have agency, or only certain types of people get to have agency. And I think about this a lot in terms of sex workers, especially in America. Because I worked as a naked model when I was young, I had a lot of friends that were in that world. And in some ways, sex workers are seen by many groups of people of many diverse backgrounds, from Christian fundamentalists to feminists, as these sort of ultimate disempowered, voiceless people, these people that can just be safely projected upon, these people who can never know their needs, who can never speak for themselves, who are objects to be saved, and who should never, ever be allowed to speak. Now, in the US, a major problem facing sex workers is violence that's done by the police. And this is a drawing from an investigative piece I did about these courts in the Bronx that were called human trafficking intervention courts. And these places were very interesting. They were premised on the idea that every single woman and man, but it was all women there, was a trafficked person, all of them. And so the idea of the courts, because these are trafficked people, they were going to help them. And the way that they would help these allegedly trafficked people was that the police, these same police who had a history of, raping and stealing the money of sex workers, would go and arrest them, and then they would throw them in jail, and then they would take them out in front of the court after they'd been, in a cell for a few days, and after they'd undergone all the trauma of arrest and maybe worse, and they'd put them before a judge, and the judge would speak to them in this very soft tone, and she'd be like, "Would you like to get some counseling?" It's this sort of Kafkaesque thing, right? And it's this notion that authority, that experts, that people in law enforcement industry, people in NGOs, had the right to quote unquote save people and build their careers on saving them by never ever listening to them and never ever listening to what they said they needed. Because if they ever listened to any sex worker, one of the first things that person would tell them was that they didn't want to be arrested, particularly not people who had a history of raping their friends. And that would probably be something that every trafficking victim would say too. But this sort of system of interventions and speaking over people and not listening to them, it's a machine. It's how NGOs make their money, and it's how people, get good jobs that build resumes. It's how law enforcement gets paid. It's a machine. And even more than providing money, it provides a feeling of virtue. And the grist of this system is people, men and women who are told, the world is told they can't choose and they can't speak for themselves. Now, a lot of the discourses around sex workers reminded me of some discourses around refugees. No, both Lebanon and Turkey, for all the problems and for all of the abuse that refugees have had, they have done something that the U.S. would never, ever, ever have done. They have taken in massive quantities of people fleeing a war zone. America, my country, is a country when children, from Central America, risk their lives crossing a desert to come to safety in America. Those children are put into bus shelters, locked up, and then deported back to their deaths. So. I often feel that, that Turkey and Lebanon get nowhere near as much credit as they deserve for what they have done. Now, the First World, though, what the First World does with refugees is different. The First World pays a lot of lip service to treating refugees well, but in actuality, they do as much as possible to hold them back. I mean, under Gaddafi, Libya was a country that was paid to keep refugees from coming into the EU, and currently Turkey just took a massive bribe to do the same thing, right? And when you keep refugees from coming into the EU, that means you're doing it in a violent way. And we're living at this moment when the rich world is facing this choice. The rich world can either accept that migration and refugees are things that aren't going to go away, that people will move, that movement is a precondition of human nature, and particularly at a time when people's relationships are more cross-border than ever, where people can more easily imagine futures for themselves in other countries. It's not possible to stop people from moving. And so the rich world can either accept that they're part of the rest of the world, a world that they always plundered, and that, in fact, by plundering the rest of the world, that's what made them the rich world, so they can accept that they're part of the rest of the world. Or else they can try to wall themselves off with more police and more fences and more bribes to authoritarian states that border them and more violence. And I don't know which the rich world will choose, but looking at the rise of right-wing parties, I fear the choice that they will make. But because of the rich world has a certain self-conception, right? It credits itself with a certain sort of kindness, of being good and humanitarian. And it doesn't want to think that it's the sort of place that just would unjustly restrict movement to those with first world passports. They have to make an excuse for it, just like the excuse of these courts that were arresting sex workers but saying it was to save them. They have to say, no, we're not. It's not about restricting people's right to freedom of movement and allowing our corporations to plunder the rest of the world while closing our borders to workers seeking better opportunities, or closing our borders to people seeking safety. It's not about that, no. Our interest in restricting people's movement is purely humanitarian. We just want to stop smugglers and save children from drowning. It's purely humanitarian. This is the way that those in power always cloak their violence, and the violence that maintains their power, through the voice of paternalism. They don't listen to the people that they're affecting, and they always say they're doing a good thing. These are drawings I did, by the way, in Syria, in the Bab al-Salam IDP camp. In this last fall, I had the honor of being invited by Doctors Without Borders to document their work in Iraqi Kurdistan at a refugee camp called Domiz. Now, Domiz is actually one of the better organized camps that I've been to. It wasn't like the ones in the Bekaa. It was run by the UNHCR. It had an infrastructure. It had wedding dress shops. Many of them were really trying to build a life there. 40,000 mostly Kurdish Syrian refugees lived there. And as I was there, the Syrian refugee crisis, I should use quote unquote, but the issue of Syrian refugees was dominating the news. And so MSF introduced me to a number of families who were about to make the trip to Europe. And I drew them and I interviewed them. And these are people who may have been born in Kamishlu or born in other villages in Kurdish parts of Syria. But almost everyone I spoke to had spent their adulthoods in Damascus or Aleppo, in these great, amazing, massive cities. I met an aeronautics engineer. I met the former owner of a chain of souvenir shops. I met a waiter at a high-end restaurant, a graphic designer. A guy who built this like small studio next to his shack, and he was doing these like amazing paintings. Many of the doctors and nurses at MSF were Syrian refugees themselves. And so I would visit these families and I would ask them, why are they making the trips to Europe? And they would take out like, their lovely coffee sets. They'd make me some wonderful coffee. And then they would tell me that they wanted futures for their children. And they absolutely knew the risks. They, knew people who had drowned. They watched the news religiously. There was like a personal Wi-Fi hotspot in practically everyone's tent. But they were going anyway, and they were absolutely determined. And the news was not going to stop them because they wanted to have something for their children, at least, that resembled the life that they thought they might have had. So this woman, I asked her, it was a rather thick question, I asked her what she was bringing on the boat to Europe. I was like, are you bringing any souvenirs? And she looks at me like that's the stupidest thing she ever heard in her life. And it's like, and I asked her, and she said, no, man, I left all my memories in Syria. No, there's a huge legal importance to the word refugee. It supposedly guarantees certain rights, even though we know that states ignore that. But it's also a flattening word, and it strips individuality away, and it brings to mind instead this like huddled mass of people who have been victimized who you can maybe help or condescend to. But it's a word that evokes pity, and pity is a corrosive thing. In this essay by Hannah Arendt that I've always loved, We Refugees, she writes, "We fight like madmen for private existences with individual destinies." And she wrote that when she herself was a refugee from the Nazis. And now, when these families that I met were deciding to take this trip to Europe, they were choosing many things, but one of them was a sort of individual destiny. They were refusing to wait passively in a tent for geopolitics, for those in the rich world to decide their future, and they were taking matters into their own hands. This is perhaps the collaboration I'm proudest of in life. It's a collaboration I did with a young Syrian journalist named Marwan Hisham, who is by far one of the bravest and smartest and toughest human beings I've ever been lucky enough to meet. I met Marwan on social media. We just would mock people who we thought were dumb, both on sort of the 2013 circle of people who were reading a lot of news about Syria. And we got to know each other better because he asked me to draw his portrait for his birthday, and I said yes. But Marwan was in Raqqa at that time. He is from Raqqa, it's his hometown. Like many people, he was too poor to leave, and also a lot of people there, their families had invested their entire life savings into real estate, and when their town got invaded, they didn't want to give up everything to the invaders. So he stayed. He stayed when Raqqa was occupied by Daesh. And I think this is very important because sometimes there's this idea that everyone in Raqqa is Daesh, and so it's fine for any country in the world that wants to bomb them because you're not killing any civilians, and that's not true. There's a lot of many people there still who were just too poor to leave, and they're usually the main ones that suffer. But anyway, in 2014, before the coalition started bombing, so there's only one group bombing Raqqa, I asked Marwan to send me cell phone photos. And I thought that these were just going to be the sort of cell phone photos that we all have, that, lying around on our phones, just like daily life. But instead he was like, these are the scenes I want you to see. It's like, here are the signs that Daesh censored. Or he's like, here are kids looking through the trash, because Daesh always has this propaganda that, they have such good social safety welfare net, and it's all lies. So here's a picture of children looking through the trash for something to sell. He chose, like, very specifically scenes that he wanted me to draw. Or the clock tower where Daesh had severed the heads of the statues on top. And together we worked on this collaboration whose idea in part was to take a place that no photojournalist could go to and to create images of it, of daily life, that had all of the care and thought that photojournalism would have, but that were done in a medium that people weren't used to. It was a way of both subverting ISIS propaganda, but also subverting American propaganda, that the Middle East is nothing but something that has always been a war zone, and not just a place where people also live. As me and Marwan worked together, he developed into an astounding journalist who, I mean, this is a guy who, some months ago, he filed from Raqqa with a Raqqa Dateline for the New York Times. I mean, from an internet cafe that was where ISIS guys were sitting next to him who, if they had looked at his phone, they probably would have shot him in the head, and he wrote a beautiful article, and he published it. I mean, he's an astounding human. But we kept collaborating. This is a piece we did when he went to Mosul of a property that had been stolen from Christian citizens. And later, after he escaped to Aleppo, to rebel-held parts of Aleppo, I tried to draw the aftermath of a barrel bombing. We're working on a book now. I hope it'll be as good as these. No, there's this cliche that journalists have about giving voice to the voiceless. And I hate this. To me, this is the most repellent of ideas. There is no one that is voiceless in the world. We all come fully equipped with voices. And if someone seems voiceless, it's usually because they're being silenced, like a prisoner in Guantanamo, or ignored, like a Syrian on the ground. But it's not because they're voiceless. And the idea of giving voice to the voiceless is essentially a charitable way of thinking. And charity always positions the giver as someone who is superior to and better than the person who is receiving. And because of that, I always try to, in my work, and I always ask everyone else to reject charity, and instead to turn to solidarity, to acknowledging fellow humanity. Because solidarity, not charity, is what might actually strip people's unjust privileges away. But on the subject of people who are presumed to be voiceless, this man, Carrington Keyes, is a whistleblower. He was imprisoned for 9 years in solitary confinement in Pennsylvania, 9 years, in a cell with no window, covered in mold. For several of the first years, he wasn't given any books to read. And this is actually quite common in America. They don't consider solitary confinement torture. And there are people who have been locked in these holes for decades. So Carrington is an extraordinary man, and he's very, very political. His mother, Chandra, there, brought him up in this super political and anti-imperialist tradition. And so when he was in jail, he organized with his fellow prisoners, and they began documenting human rights abuses at the prison. They began documenting racism by guards, or beatings, or starvation, denial of food, and giving them to a local human rights group. And because of that, one night, the guards began beating up one of the people in this group that was giving out these reports. And so Carrington and 5 other prisoners that he knew, they covered their windows with their sheets, the inside, their interior windows. And this was a way of getting prison management down, because they had to. What was the rule? It was they had, if the guard couldn't see inside the cell, they had to call the boss. And they were very adamant. There was videotape, and we're being denied our rights. We want to speak to the public defender's office. We want to speak to the media. But instead of doing that, the prison sent down a gentleman dressed like this, who proceeded to fill their cells with tear gas and come in with electrified shields and tasers and batons and beat them, cut off their clothes, put hoods over their heads, and leave them shackled, soaked in tear gas for a really long time. And then, after this was all over and they'd shipped them all to different prisons, they charged them with rioting. And the men refused to plea bargain, and so this case has been, for the last 5 years, sort of dragging on and on. It's finally actually going to trial as we speak. And I became interested in this case because I was like, wait a second, rioting is a group activity. These guys are in solitary confinement. How do you riot if you're locked alone in your cell? So I did this piece on on the Dallas Six. And if anyone in the world is like being silenced or attempted to be silenced, it's these guys, these people whose communication with the outside world is so censored, who are locked and caged in these little boxes, who every time they go outside to a court appearance are like shackled and in leg irons. And yet these are also people who would write me letters quoting Assata Shakur and Thomas Paine and like situating what was happening to them in the context of American military detention. These were people who were in no way voiceless. The state was just trying to silence them. Now, it's impossible to sit here as an American and not talk about Donald Trump. I know. I wish I couldn't, but I feel it's I feel the Cheetos Hitler is the sort of unspoken the unspoken orange shadow in the room. So I met Trump actually. I met him in Dubai. In 2014, I crashed a press conference that he was doing. I talked my way in, and when it was question time, it was a press conference, by the way, for some golf courses that he was licensing his name to, and I found out that his guys were getting paid $200 a month to do really, really brutal work. And so when it was question time, I got up and I asked him about those guys, and he didn't answer me, and I was roundly yelled at, which now in this context seems like so gentle, but it really just showed that even then Trump did not like the media and he did not like questions. And in the last year, obviously, his hostility, his dislike of press and protesters and questions has become more and more apparent. And sometimes people, they say, like, what differentiates Trump from the other candidates? Because, I mean, Ted Cruz is a horrifying racist conspiracy theorist and Islamophobe also, you know. And also, there's a certain amount of violence and Islamophobia that's just like baked into how US law works. For instance, there's a lot of quotes on Trump saying something asinine, but they changed the visa waiver program to essentially make European citizens of like Iranian or Syrian or Sudanese or Iraqi descent exempt from the visa waiver program that all other European citizens have with America. So there are like these like polite bureaucratic changes to the law that are actually quite devastating on people's lives too, that don't get any press because they're kind of boring and they're not as sexy as Cheetos Hitler. But what differentiates Trump, in my view, isn't necessarily that his ideas are worse. It's that while the other candidates would like to do violence, they would like to do state violence, you know, they like delegate it to somewhere else. He's the only one I personally believe would actually like to stand above a mob while they beat someone to death, like and bathe in the blood. I think that's actually what Trump has done. That's the ground that he has broken. He is. Trump is direct violence. And so people always ask me, like, why? Why is your country, why have they gone crazy? Why is this your Republican frontrunner? What the hell is wrong with you? Why did you devolve further? And so I feel like I have to explain this on a few levels. The first is for a lot of Americans, there was this notion that, you know, your children's lives would always be better than you, and there'd be a certain amount of, you know, you'd work hard and you would not die of starvation. That was supposed to be the American consensus. And, you know, obviously in the last some decades with neoliberalism and globalization and bank bailouts and all sorts of things that we already know about and other people could explain better, that's been broken. And people know that the politicians that broke that aren't Trump. They're more like these like meat puppets like Cruz, or that, you know, are utterly manipulated. And so they look at Trump and they're like, oh, he's not like them. The other thing is a lot of white people in America, they view the tiny steps that have been made towards equality as not as equality at all, but rather as infringing on their God-given rights, and they're really, really angry. They see the idea of their unjust privileges being chipped away at not as justice, but as some sort of crime, and so they retreat back into this sort of, I guess, like white supremacist-based sense of victimhood. And this is terrifying and it's dangerous, and whether or not Trump wins, he made fascism speakable. And he provided a focal point for these followers of this sort of American reality TV flavored fascism to find each other. And what comes out of that, what comes out of his followers finding each other, this sort of OK Cupid moment that he provided for American fascists, that might be the longest lasting and most terrifying legacy, even when his candidacy hopefully crashes and burns. And Trump isn't alone in this. You know, we're facing a wave of global authoritarianism, from Putin and Modi to Erdogan to UKIP to the National Front. there's a global retreat from universal values and universal ethics to communal-based ones, and whether that community is a religion or an ethnic group, or whether the community is holding a privileged passport and believe that has the power of empire behind it and believing you could lock the rest of the world out, I see us retreating to these things. And I believe that the only thing that we have against that is a sort of universal values, which I don't think are Enlightenment values. The Enlightenment, the much ballyhooed Enlightenment people were people who held slaves. And I don't believe that they're American values, because those are usually a way of misusing words like democracy and freedom as fig leaves to justify wars, justify Gitmo. But I do think that we need to hold to this belief that freedom and dignity and equality are birthrights, regardless of where someone sits or where someone was born, on which side of which imaginary line. And I believe that that's the only thing, perhaps one of the only things, that we can hold against this global wave of Trumps. And as I wrote this speech, I didn't know whether to speak about journalism or to speak about art, and those things are fraught and they often feel futile, especially now. But in this time of intense flux, I cling to these things more than ever. And I'm an artist by birth, so I'll start by talking about that. In one of my favorite books by Ben Davis, 9.5 Theses on Art in Class, he calls Guernica, Picasso's massive painting, quote unquote, an indubitably heroic example of political art. The painting portrays the deaths of civilians under aerial bombardment during the Spanish Civil War. But what Davis is saying is heroic isn't the content of the painting, it's not the paint strokes, it's its effects. In 1937, when the painting was on exhibition, the price to see it in London was to bring a pair of boots that would then be shipped off to the Spanish front to fight fascism. And the gallery collected 15,000 pairs. Now, radicals often suspect beauty of corruption, and though they sometimes can be uptight and unbearable, they're right, particularly about one thing. Art cannot change the world. Pens can't take on swords, let alone predator drones. But as disappointment and violence and authoritarianism spread, the antidote is a generosity that the best art can still inspire. Art is hope against cynicism and creation against entropy. To make art is an act of both love and defiance. And though I'm a cynic, I believe those things are all we have. And I'll start, or I'll end, by giving a few thoughts on journalism, too. Because often when I do these things in the States, they ask me to make grand sweeping statements about the future of journalism. I don't know, and I don't think anyone else does either. But I thought about the notion of that, of what would the future of journalism be? And so I think that for those of us who create art or journalism or anything, we live in the best of times and the worst of times. There is more brilliant work from more perspectives, and it's being published in more places than ever before. And sitting here, you could read the words of Dalit activists in India. You could read people in Ferguson who are organizing their communities. You can read people from everywhere. But the old model of bundling ads and investigative journalism, which was a lucky historical accident, is dead, long dead, and nothing is replacing it but marketing and sponsored content. And journalists are under threat by armed groups and by governments, and most of all by brokenness. And in the multiplicity of information, it becomes harder than ever for the truth to be heard. So my final thoughts on the future of journalism. Journalism is perfect. Journalism is broken. Journalism is magnificent and destroyed. And every week, some startup comes and they say they have one weird trick that's going to save journalism or save art or save creativity. And they might mean well, but they're lying, because they can't save us. The internet is not going to save artists, nor journalists, nor creators. Social media won't save us. Micropayments and subscriptions won't save us. Crowdfunding won't save us, and nor will companies. Grants won't save us. Patrons won't save us, and governments won't save us. Nothing will save us, except for ourselves and each other. And now let's make some powerful things. Thank you. And thank you for everyone who sat through that on this gorgeous day. And if you have any questions, I'm directed to ask you. So please ask me if you have any questions.
I have a question. First of all, to begin with, thank you for giving us this talk. But I really like the way that you rendered the skin tones in the paintings, the way that you can actually see the blue and the yellow, and the times where the color would actually bleed off the drawing. But what really intrigued me is the part where the images about those prisoners who were forcibly fed, and the fact that the Americans were trying to legitimize their acts. I don't think I can get that, but the American prisoners were trying to legitimize their actions, so they actually did not paint their faces, and you drew them those kind of neutral smileys. But what really intrigued me is the fact that you made the prisoners themselves invisible by coloring their faces black. I understand that you're trying to protect their identities, or any...
No, I wasn't allowed to. I wasn't allowed to draw their faces. I was, while I was on Guantanamo, I was literally watched at every single moment. Like, there was a guard that was following me around, and afterwards they sat with me in the car, and there were empty spaces where the prisoners' heads were, and they were like, "What are you going to do with those? You're not going to draw on those, are you?" And I had to scribble them black there. But the only reason that I did the black scribble as opposed to draw them from behind is I wanted to make it really clear that I was being censored.
Okay, so it's not a matter of visibility, it was more of a political action for censorship.
Exactly, yeah, because I think that I wanted to show the censorship with my drawing. If I was going to be censored in something, I didn't want to like pretend and make it look nice. Hey.
I wanted to ask you, in every place you went, you've been speaking to all of these organizers, all of these people who are working to sort of try to resist in one way or another. And as you said, we're seeing a growth of fascism. Fascism is on the rise again, pretty much everywhere. Aren't you finding that there's also a rise of solidarity, a rise of maybe anarchism, or like new forms of anarchism, new forms of trying to think non-authoritarian solidarity, and trying to reconstruct something new, a new ideology after the death of ideology in a sense?
I mean, I think perhaps I haven't been spending my time in the most hopeful spaces. So while I'm sure that there is so much of that, I haven't necessarily been deeply immersed in it. Though one thing I will say is one of the most beautiful things to come out of this election cycle, because like, so what beautiful thing comes out of an American presidential cycle? Surely not. Was in Chicago, Muslim and Black and Mexican young people, you know, older people, but a lot of young people, they got together and they shut down the Trump rally. And they shut down the Trump rally in solidarity with each other. And they showed him Chicago wasn't welcome, and it was intensely powerful, and it was an alliance of groups that that are ritualistically kicked in American politics, standing up and saying, no, we are powerful, and you can't come to our city, and you can't spew fascism here. Any other questions?
In thinking about your work, I was thinking about Ben Davis's book that you mentioned. I was thinking about asking it, because in that same essay he talks about in Guernica, my interpretation of that essay is he feels like he looks at these three examples of what's supposed to be the strongest, most potent political art, and he seems, in my reading, like unconvinced, like that these things sort of fall short. And that, you know, talking about Guernica specifically, he says that it is about Guernica because it's contextualized about Guernica, but there's something in the painting itself that's actually like of Guernica. It's just, we talk about it in that way. And in hearing, sort of looking about your background, one word that was used to identify you was the word sort of activist. And I don't know, I'm sort of struggling, because I struggle with the divide between art and politics and what art can do, and if this is a way to sort of make a life and commit yourself to sort of doing good. And I just wonder, you know, you talked about a lot of ways that you've gone to these amazing places, you've seen things that we can't see with photography, but I'm just wondering how you sort of measure the impact of that, or how you see yourself relative to sort of activism. You know, I commend you for what you're doing, but I'm struggling to sort of see.
No, I agree with you, by the way. I don't consider myself an activist. Anyone who, and in any article about it, if they ask me, I say that. I think that I have politics, which I think people should have, like, not because I'm like an artist, or just because we're all people, you know, doing jobs, and we should try to make the world better and more just because we're human, not because artists have a special responsibility, because artists aren't special. And I love Ben's cynicism about political art, and I think it's actually quite apt in so many ways. And the reason that I love that particular quote is it said, like, what did Guernica actually do politically? It got a lot of boots to fight fascism. Like that was Guernica's political impact. And I think that in terms of what impact art can make, art can inspire people to do concrete things in the world. And very often in like incredibly unexpected ways. I mean, Chelsea Manning burned all of those files onto a Lady Gaga CD. You never know what's going to inspire acts of heroism and what's going to inspire acts of anti-authoritarianism. And very often it's like complete pop culture that one never would have thought of that. But yeah, I mean, I think artists are always like super fraught, and I hate the notion that like art has just this like magical power to like make everything good and skippy, and that it's like you know, automatically like great activism to do a picture of like someone holding their fist up. I mean, it can be like if it raises money for bail funds, you know, or boots to go to the Spanish front. So I guess I think of art more in what it can do to inspire concrete actions, and yeah, like I totally applaud your skepticism of it.
But in the but again, like the context in which art's made within you reference like the oligarchies, you reference like the systems of powers in which museums and industries are in. Yet in some ways, like as a journalist, as an artist, you exist like in relation to those systems. So you're fighting like in your own viewership, like the same things that you're sort of criticizing. So I just sort of look at this and I'm like, oh. What way forward? And I'm just like, in discussing this talk, you were identified as someone who's like grappling outside of the institution. So I'm asking for like concrete things that you see for like a way forward for art and politics.
Well, I mean, I think artists are workers, and you know, workers exist within capitalism. I mean, you have a lot of university professors, right, in America who like consider themselves like super like Marxist and like super woke and everything, but they're working at universities and getting paid by universities that are like doing stuff for like the military. I think it's very hard for people to exist outside of that, though certainly there are people, you know, who do, and I applaud them, but I'm by far not one of them. I mean, I write for Vice. I think it's, you make your compromises and you do the best you can.
Thank you.
Hi, Molly.
Hey.
I just want to probably help the illustration students ask a few questions. So maybe we can talk about process, or how you go about drawing your portraits. Do you draw them with ink and then do the watercolor later on at another stage? Do you carry all your equipment with you? You know, what is the ease of, or is it part here, part there? Just a little bit about the process would be great, I think.
So I do it two different types of ways. This is a watercolor that I did in my studio. Usually when I do something like this, I pour a lot. God, this feels like so like cool and technical. So I pour lots of water onto the page, and then I throw dye into it, and it all spreads and bleeds. And then I have a bunch of different colored inks and some nibs, and some of them are really, really fine. I like these very, very fine Japanese nibs. And I sort of sketch it out. I, you know, add different colors to it, and you know, I draw the thing. Something like this would be done from a photograph, but something like these are done from life. And I would have a bunch of pens and crayons and markers, and I would just sort of sit and sketch what was in front of me.
Thanks. Just a minute.
Hi. Do you often find yourself in situations where you're asked to give the portraits to people? And can you tell us about, because you were talking about the fact of representing them while they're looking at you doing it, as opposed to having a camera?
Yes, I am, and I draw fast, so often I do, if I have time. When I did a portrait of a woman in Gaza that I really liked, and I actually had a friend smuggle prints back in for her, and we tracked her down and gave it to her. But generally, I just do it on the spot because that's easier, and you know, that's the benefit of drawing fast.
You keep the drawings.
Well, something like this, for instance, I might do this one for me, right? And then I'll do another one maybe for her. And I just tear it out of my book and give it to her.
I was curious about the Guantanamo images, which I really love. I knew a bit about your trip there. From the art point of view, have you ever thought about maybe not drawing then from memory some of the things that had been censored while you were there, like just sort of almost speaking back to the censors by, you saw it, you can draw it once you're no longer subject to the censorship regime?
I did that once. I was provided with these photos by lawyers of the detainees, and so I drew from those. A lot of them were Red Cross photos because I wanted to like do these like really intense and intensely crafted portraits of people who were in Guantanamo. But in some ways, I actually felt like the act of the censorship itself was more revealing than the details of someone's face. I mean, for instance, I don't actually care what a 19-year-old who's working at Gitmo does. I think that they're part of a machine, and rendering their face into that sort of neutral thing is probably more revealing than like what that particular 19-year-old prison guard looks like.
Hi. So my name's Nadeem. I've been a journalist for the last couple of years. Until I quit recently, was working for Reuters. Now, when you approach journalism, you talked about emotion and from a certain political slant. And the thing is, for me, from my academic background, from my journalistic background and experiences, we are told from a very early period, you know, when you approach a subject matter, you have to approach it in a very non-emotional way, so that you understand the situation, you analyze, you speak to them, you don't bring your own prejudices or your own ideas and thoughts into it. But that seems to be kind of at odds with what you're saying, which is, you know, we need to, you know, allow our basic human desires and inferences about a situation to take over. So I'm just wondering, you know, what is your stance when you come to a story? Is at what stage do you say to yourself, there needs to be some distance between myself and what's going on?
Well, when I'm starting a story, especially a big investigative piece, I usually spend months researching it beforehand, and it's not just researching the details of the story itself, but I try to read like all the literature about it, you know, all the books. I try to learn as deeply as I possibly can about it, and it's from as many different types of angles. I also, I mean, obviously, I believe in like the most rigorous sort of fact-checking and the most interrogation that you could do of your biases. But the thing is, I don't believe that it's possible for a human to be a blank recording device, and I believe that who a human being is very influences what sort of stories they would get. I mean, and the problem is when you assume that you do have no bias, and when you assume that that's something that you've internalized, very often all sorts of biases get through. A very typical thing in America is that for a long time, it was considered completely acceptable and completely objective journalism just to write down what police said as if it was a fact. And like police are just like, they're just proven to be liars in America. You know, that it's actually not factual to write down what they said as anything more than what a party with a historic tendency to lying would say. But that sort of thing wore the garb of objectivity. It wore the garb of like being an unemotional and professional thing to do. And I think that if one can't interrogate their own biases, and not that you should have your emotions shape the story, but if one can't acknowledge that they have those emotions, those things just tend to be invisible, and then you just bring that to the story anyway. But it hasn't been addressed or interrogated. Habib?
Yeah. Should I wait or just talk?
Oh God, I'm sorry. I didn't see you.
Thanks. It was really great, and the pictures are very interesting. Especially useful here in Beirut, we're often told not to take pictures, and there are many pictures you want to take but you can't take. So maybe drawing is a way to get around that. When you work with these, you know, major publications like the New York Times, and I mean, do you ever find that you come up against a wall with an editor when you're trying to tell a nuanced story about the region? I feel that there's a thirst for dichotomies and stereotypes, you know, Hezbollah and Lebanon, and you know, Sunni extremist or whatever. So how do you deal with that, and is that an issue?
In some ways I'm kind of lucky because I do this weird freak art form that like no one actually hires me unless they want the strange thing that I do. But yes, God, oh my God, like I feel like my friend was joking that if you just add a dash of dice to your story, it didn't even matter if it fit, that's all you needed to sell it. Yes, it's like, especially American journalism wants to either see like Syrian refugee on boat or a man in black ski mask who can scare them. And there's like there's very little nuance in between. I've had a lot of freedom, I think because I came into the field as someone who was a well-known artist beforehand. So I didn't go through the apprenticeship that a lot of other people do that has its many wonderful points, but also unfortunately sometimes has to do with conforming more to an editor's vision. And I haven't had as much for me, but yes, I see it all the time, and yeah, it's galling. And I think what I've seen more almost is that it's not that editors try to push people, it's just that because there are so many journalists, editors just won't commission nuanced stories in the first place.
Because there's so many.
Yeah, there's so many journalists pitching so many stories that an editor can just be like, oh, here's my nuanced story pitch, not interested, and move on to the next.
Hi. I work with the Red Cross that you mentioned, and I'm in contact with refugees and vulnerable population maybe on a daily basis or at least a weekly basis. And one thing that you said that I agree with is that they're not voiceless at all. They're not. They have a lot to say, and people should listen and all that. But one thing that we deal with them a lot, and so we hear them what they say. Sometimes, for lack of a better word, they are fed up with the photographers, with journalists who are spinning these same stories about them. These people need help, like making them voiceless and all that. Do they react differently when you try to paint them, when you draw them? Do they react differently? Do they like it? Do they appreciate it? Or what is the reaction?
I mean, I try never to draw someone who's not interested in being drawn. When I did these things, it was in collaboration with the MSF, and a lot of these were like people's friends in Domies, like they were, you know, someone who knew someone, and I was invited into their homes. I think if you're a photographer who are taking these like pictures that you have to like make a split-second decision, it might be much harder to do that. But yeah, I just in general, I try not to draw people in vulnerable situations who don't want to be drawn, and that's just my personal thing.
I have two questions. One is about color. I mean, as somebody who's not an artist, but your work, I mean, it seems it's mostly drawing, it's ink, you can work without color, and I was wondering what's your relationship to color? Do things have to have color because people want color? What does color mean to you, if that makes sense as a question? And then my second question is, it seems like you started as an artist, and then you became kind of a writer. I mean, that became a bigger part of what you were doing. Do you have any thoughts on what did your background as an artist, or as not just background, but as your activity and still continually affects your writing or influences your writing or gives you a toolbox in writing that might be useful for people to consider, even if they're not, you know, you're an artist, became writers, maybe writers should think about being artists or something like that.
Oh man, those are awesome questions. So the first is, in terms of color, sometimes I limit it just because with something like this it's faster not to use color, and I don't want to take up too much of people's time. Other times when I have things like these drawings in Raqqa, I wanted to really bring focus onto the line, and sometimes color can be distracting from that. But other times, like these in Aleppo, I kind of wanted to play against these images that were coming out of Aleppo where everything is white and covered in dust from the bombings, and so I used color, I guess, a bit to like fight against that and make people see it in a different way. And in terms of what I think drawing can teach everyone, I'm not one of those people who thinks everyone is an artist deep inside. I don't believe that at all. I believe it's a bizarre and time-consuming skill to develop, somewhat like blacksmithing. And you know, maybe everyone would be if they did it for 28 years, but it takes a while. But I do believe that art can teach you some things, and one of them is it teaches you really, really sharp observation. Especially visual observation. Often when I'm writing about something, I have this like almost like maximalist way of visually noticing things and visually noticing details, and I definitely credit it to always having a sketchbook around and always breaking things down in that super visual sense.
I have two questions. One question is, when you're replying back to him about how you do not classify yourself as an activist, but you do, obviously you're an artist and you're a journalist and you are trying to create that space. So how are these, I mean, are those labels you don't want to fall under? How do you separate these two things from each other? That's one. And my second question is, you started off saying that you do a lot of the paintings are on the street. So you do the art and you work with the people, which is really awesome, but then how do you transfer that to creating a space such as this one right here, or a space outside of institutional walls and actually connecting with the people on a bigger space? Like, do you do more street art, or do you do, I don't know, workshops? And you know, like, what's the space? How do you create that space to move this art and activism and journalism forward with other crowds?
So I mean, I'll call myself an artist and a journalist just because I work in both those spaces. I don't call myself an activist because I know these amazing activists who, you know, are like organizing people all the time and like bringing down, you know, corrupt officials and, you know, organizing marches, and I see the work that they do, and I see the commitment that goes to that, and I know that I don't do anything near what they do, and so I just don't think it's fair to them. It's like misleading to call myself an activist when I see what full-time activists actually do. In terms of creating a space...
So activism, and you believe, is more one-on-one building?
No, I mean, when someone says that they're an activist, as opposed, I mean, I think activism is something that we can, you know, all participate in to different degrees, but when someone says they're an activist, I tend to associate it with these like very, very committed people, you know, who devote so much time and resources to it. In terms of doing stuff outside of institutional spaces, I don't know. I mean, I guess I don't really come from an institutional space, so I mean, my last gallery show, I just rented a storefront, and a lot of very different types of people come in. I tend to find on a personal level, even though I'm sure it's fine for a lot of people, I tend to find the vocabulary of a lot of fine art quite exclusionary and alienating, and I don't use it also because I don't understand it and couldn't convincingly speak it, and that definitely attracts a different sort of person to my work.
So basically making it more in stores, or like more accessible spaces for everyone.
I guess so, yeah.
Okay, probably we should just keep it to one or two more so Molly's not exhausted and can continue for the rest of the night.
Ben, just two quick questions.
Are you using the last two?
The first is, who are the hardest people to draw that you have found hardest people to draw? And the second question, who do you find to be the most obedient journalists and artists out there?
Most obedient? Oh God, do you know there's a video camera here? Look, he's turning it right towards me. I'm not going to name names on that because that's not fair. That's not fair or that interesting. Though it's a very, very good question, and I applaud your troublemaking, sir. I mean, I could just say Nick Kristof, that's easy. In terms of the hardest people to draw, I tend to find people who are just like very symmetrically pretty kind of hard to draw, to be honest, because, so this is how kind of a way that, something that Scott McDonald, who's a real pioneer of comics, said. He like made sort of a gradation of faces, and on one end there's like, you know, the smiley face, and the other end there's like super individualized face. And very often you can, especially if you come from comics, you learn to draw people's faces and get their caricatures by their deviations from a bland smiley face. And a lot of times certain types of symmetrical beauty are defined as their closeness to that. And so that it becomes harder to get someone's individuality. But I mean, to be honest, I love drawing all faces. Like I mean, people are just really cool and interesting looking, and they usually have something beautiful or fascinating about their faces, so I like them all. Any other questions?
Even if they are, they can ask you later on Twitter.
Well, thank you so much, and for spending this beautiful day listening to me go on about my artwork and about my thoughts on various things. My book is over there. I would happily sign it and draw a cat in it for you if you should so like. And it was my immense honor to be here, and thank you so much to Alina and to Walid.
Thank you so much.